Millions of PH jobs at risk after China embassy warning. Two nuclear-armed superpowers stood at the edge of a war that analysts warned could reshape the entire Middle East and possibly trigger a global catastrophe. The United States deployed not one, but two aircraft carrier strike groups to the Persian Gulf. Iran's supreme leader told Washington that America, quote, may be struck so hard that it cannot get back up. Oil prices spiked, gold hit record highs, and the world held its breath. But then, something extraordinary happened. Tonight, we break down exactly how the United States and Iran stepped back from the deadliest confrontation in decades. Who blinked first? What was said in secret back channels, and why this crisis is far from over. Stay with us, because what happens next could determine whether the Middle East burns or breathes. Good evening and welcome. I'm your anchor, and tonight we are covering what has been described by European security analysts as one of the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoints since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 2026 United States-Iran confrontation. A crisis that erupted in mid-January, escalated through February, and is now, as of this week, showing the first fragile signs of diplomatic movement. Let's go back to the beginning, because context here is everything. You cannot understand where we are today without understanding the chain of events that brought two of the world's most consequential military powers to the edge of open warfare. It started, as so many crises in history have started, with the people. Beginning on December 28, 2025, protests erupted across all 31 provinces of Iran. The trigger was economic desperation, a collapsed currency, hyperinflation, international sanctions that had been reimposed in September 2025 by the United Kingdom, France, and Germany after Iran was found to be in what they called significant non-performance of the 2015 nuclear agreement. The UN sanctions that followed targeted Iran's nuclear and missile programs directly. But what began as economic protest rapidly morphed into something far more dangerous for the Iranian regime, a direct challenge to the Islamic Republic itself. Thousands of demonstrators filled the streets, calling not just for better living conditions, but for systemic political change. The regime, with hardline factions at its most belligerent, responded with force. Thousands of civilians were killed. Mass detentions followed. On January 13, 2026, U.S. President Donald Trump told Iranians to, quote, keep protesting, adding that help is on its way. It was an extraordinary statement, a sitting American president publicly encouraging regime change in a country with which the United States has had no diplomatic relations since 1979, and which possesses a substantial ballistic missile arsenal. Iranian officials responded the same day, warning that their forces were, and I quote directly from their statement, ready for war. The crisis was now in the open, and it was accelerating fast. Over the following 2 weeks, the United States conducted what military analysts are calling the largest naval deployment to the Middle East since the region descended into its current crisis in 2023. On January 26, 2026, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier flanked by destroyers, submarines, and support vessels, deployed to the region. This alone would have been alarming, but it was only the beginning. President Trump then announced the deployment of a second aircraft carrier strike group. Think about what that means in terms of firepower. 2 full carrier battle groups, with their associated air wings, missile defense systems, and attack submarines, positioned within striking distance of Iranian territory. The Pentagon simultaneously reviewed force protection measures at American bases in Iraq, Syria, and across the Gulf. The Department of Defense was not planning for negotiation. It was planning for contingency. On February 19th, reports from CBS News and multiple intelligence sources indicated the White House was prepared to launch military strikes within days if a diplomatic breakthrough did not materialize. Trump himself confirmed he was prepared to make a decision within 10 days. He referred to the naval deployment as an armada, led by the Abraham Lincoln, heading in Iran's direction. His message was direct: make a deal or face the consequences.
Meanwhile, Iran was not sitting still. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei appeared on state television and delivered a warning of his own, stating that if the United States renewed attacks against the Iranian regime, America could be struck so hard it could not recover. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which the United States had designated as a terrorist organization since 2019, announced plans for a 2-day naval exercise in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically sensitive choke points on Earth, through which approximately 20% of the world's traded oil passes. The U.S. Central Command publicly warned the IRGC against those exercises, calling for professionalism. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, fired back on social media, pointing out what he called the absurdity of the United States demanding professionalism from a military it had simultaneously labeled a terrorist organization. To understand why Iran ultimately signaled a willingness to negotiate, despite its fierce rhetoric, you need to understand how dramatically Iran's position has weakened over the past 2 years. This is critical context that changes everything. In 2025, the United States and Israel conducted strikes against Iran's nuclear program and its broader military infrastructure. According to the Institute for the Study of War's Critical Threats Project, those strikes destroyed between 35 and 45% of Iran's entire ballistic missile stockpile. Iran has reportedly been working to reconstitute that stockpile, but the damage was severe. Beyond the direct military losses, Iran's network of proxy groups, what it calls the axis of resistance, failed to meaningfully support Tehran during the Israel-Iran conflict. Hezbollah in Lebanon, once Iran's most powerful proxy, has been weakened after years of conflict. Hamas, following the terms of an October 2025 ceasefire agreement, is under pressure to disarm. The Houthis in Yemen, while still active, remain isolated. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq are being pressured by the Iraqi government itself, with the Iraqi security forces in late January reportedly forcibly removing an IRGC-aligned militia from a base south of Baghdad. Syria's Bashar al-Assad, Iran's most significant regional ally, fled the country in 2024 as his government collapsed. The corridor through which Iran supplied weapons to Hezbollah, running through Iraq and Syria, is now compromised. Iran's strategic depth has shrunk considerably. Economically, the picture is equally grim. International sanctions have crippled Iran's oil exports. The rial has collapsed. Inflation is severe. Former President Hassan Rouhani publicly warned in late January 2026 that the regime could face renewed nationwide protests if it did not implement major structural reforms to address the underlying grievances that sparked the December demonstrations. Even within the system, voices were saying the status quo was unsustainable. Here's the thing, and this is a point that many analysts are making clearly. The United States, despite its overwhelming military superiority, also has very strong reasons not to want a prolonged war with Iran. The Al Jazeera Center for Studies published a detailed analysis explaining precisely this dynamic, and it is worth examining carefully. First, geography and strategy. Iran's military doctrine is not built around winning a single decisive battle. It is built around exhaustion. Iranian military planners have structured their missile and drone capabilities for continuous, sustained engagement. Small, daily launches of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, interspersed with larger salvos. Ballistic missile defense systems, including America's own THAAD batteries, are optimized for short, intense engagements, not weeks of sustained readiness. Crew fatigue, maintenance backlogs, and ammunition depletion all accumulate. Even interceptors that work are consumed. And here is a critical piece of context. During the 2025 Iran-Israel war, the United States had to step in to backstop Israel's Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 interceptor systems after they were heavily expended. America deployed its THAAD batteries and used large numbers of ship-launched SM-3 interceptors. Those interceptors are now depleted. Replenishing them takes years. Optimistic projections don't have U.S. THAAD stockpiles back to pre-conflict levels until approximately 2027.
Every interceptor used in the Middle East is one fewer available for deterrence against China in the Western Pacific, which is arguably America's most important long-term strategic priority.
Second, political and economic calculus. Analysts note that 2026 is a critical year for the Trump presidency. A prolonged, costly, and unpredictable war in the Middle East carries enormous economic risks: oil price spikes, global market disruption, potential recession. These outcomes are antithetical to Trump's political brand, which is built substantially on economic performance and nationalist priorities. A quick, symbolic demonstration of strength is politically viable. An open-ended military commitment is not. And so, while the warships sailed and the threats thundered from Washington and Tehran alike, something else was happening quietly in the background. Back-channel diplomacy, moving through multiple regional intermediaries simultaneously, was attempting to build a framework for negotiations that could give both sides a way out without either appearing to capitulate. The key diplomatic players include Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, and Oman, all of which have either relationships with both parties or strategic interests in preventing a wider conflict. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi held telephone calls with his counterparts in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey specifically to discuss the diplomatic framework. Iran's state news agency, IRNA, confirmed these contacts. The Omani Channel, which has historically served as a discreet back door between Washington and Tehran, was once again in active use. On January 31, 2026, Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One that Iran was, quote, seriously talking to us. Those 4 words were perhaps the most significant diplomatic signal of the entire crisis. Not a formal statement, not a joint communique, but a public acknowledgement from the President of the United States himself that communication was happening at the highest levels. Hours earlier, Ali Larijani, head of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, had posted on X, formerly Twitter, that the formation of a framework for negotiations was progressing. He described the media portrayal of the situation as an artificially manufactured war narrative. He did not provide details. But the timing with Trump's comment was not coincidental. Both sides were signaling simultaneously. That is not an accident in high-stakes diplomacy. That is coordination. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian then made it official. He publicly instructed Foreign Minister Araghchi to pursue, and I'm quoting the official statement here, fair and equitable negotiations guided by the principles of dignity, prudence, and expediency, provided that a suitable environment existed, free from threats and unreasonable expectations. Tehran was simultaneously examining diplomatic processes being pitched by Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, and Oman. They expected a framework for talks within days. Reports then emerged that Araghchi was scheduled to meet Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, the same envoy who had led negotiations on the Gaza ceasefire. Witkoff was also heading to Israel to meet Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is significant because Israel is deeply opposed to any nuclear deal with Iran and had been lobbying aggressively against the diplomatic process, threatening unilateral military strikes if negotiations produced what Tel Aviv considered an insufficient agreement. Netanyahu publicly urged skepticism about Iran's intentions, telling anyone who would listen that Tehran could not be trusted. So what exactly are the two sides negotiating about? The core issue is Iran's nuclear program, and specifically its uranium enrichment capacity. Iran had been enriching uranium to 60% purity, well above the levels permitted under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, commonly known as the JCPOA, the deal that Trump withdrew from during his first term in 2018, calling it a giant fiction. Iran has proposed diluting its remaining stockpile of 60% enriched uranium in exchange for a full lifting of sanctions. Washington, under Trump, has demanded the full dismantling of nuclear enrichment on Iranian soil, a far more maximalist position. Iranian officials have also made a broader offer that reportedly surprised the American delegation: a pledge to disarm and freeze the activities of Hamas, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces.
the entire architecture of Iran's regional proxy network. U.S. Special Envoy Witkoff reportedly welcomed these proposals, which sources described as unexpected by the Iranian side. This suggests Iran came into these talks with more flexibility than its public rhetoric indicated. Russia has offered to store and process Iran's enriched uranium as a confidence-building measure. China has condemned U.S. pressure and called for diplomatic resolution, while simultaneously saying it does not recognize the UN sanctions reimposed last year, a position that provides Iran some economic breathing room, but ultimately does not change the strategic calculus. In Geneva, diplomats from both sides have met, though Iran's state-aligned media has been critical of the American approach, with the government newspaper Iran accusing Washington of part-time diplomacy, suggesting that the brief visits by Witkoff and Jared Kushner reflected an oversimplified approach to a deeply complex negotiation. Analysts close to Iran's foreign ministry echoed that frustration, arguing that the Americans were treating Geneva like a diplomatic fast food restaurant, while Iran arrived with a large expert team ready for sustained, detailed engagement. The global financial system has not been a passive observer to this crisis. Escalating tensions between the United States and Iran drove oil prices sharply higher this week. Energy stocks rose across European markets as investors priced in the possibility of disruption to Persian Gulf shipping lanes. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil flows daily, became the focal point of military and market concern simultaneously. Gold, the traditional safe haven asset in times of geopolitical fear, pushed above $5,000 per ounce during peak tension periods, a more than 2% jump in a single session. Senior market analyst Kyle Rada at Capital.com told investors plainly, the fundamental driver supporting gold was the prospect of Middle East conflict and the safe haven demand that comes with it.
European analysts warned of what they called a dangerous nuclear proliferation cascade if diplomacy continued to collapse. The European Union took the unusual step on January 29th of formally labeling the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, a symbolic step that aligned Brussels more closely with Washington's longstanding position, but one that Tehran viewed as yet another escalatory provocation. For those who need the historical context, in 2015, the Obama administration negotiated the JCPOA, a landmark multilateral agreement that imposed strict limitations on Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity in exchange for sanctions relief. Iran agreed to cap its uranium enrichment at 3.67% purity, far below weapons grade, and to submit to intrusive international inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. In May 2018, President Trump unilaterally withdrew the United States from the agreement, reimposing sweeping economic sanctions in what his administration called a maximum pressure campaign. Iran initially maintained its JCPOA commitments for about a year, then progressively abandoned them as the promised economic benefits never materialized. By 2021, Iran was enriching to 60%, a level that has no civilian nuclear energy justification and is a direct stepping stone toward weapons-grade 90% enrichment. The Biden administration attempted to revive the deal, but failed. Now, under Trump's second term, the U.S. is again demanding Iran's full denuclearization, a position Iran says is incompatible with its sovereignty and security needs. This is the gap that negotiators are attempting to bridge in Geneva, in Muscat, and through the back channels of Ankara, Doha, and Riyadh. So, where does this leave us? The honest answer is on a knife's edge. Both the United States and Iran have signaled willingness to talk. Trump said so publicly. Iran's president ordered his foreign minister to negotiate. Back channels are active. The framework exists, at least in outline. But the obstacles are enormous. Israel is actively working to undermine the diplomatic process, threatening its own unilateral military action if it believes a deal is emerging that it considers dangerous. Iran's hardline domestic factions are deeply skeptical of any agreement with Washington and have accused the government of compromising national dignity.
Within Iran, the gap between what officials say domestically and what they propose in foreign negotiations has been publicly noted by multiple analysts, suggesting the Iranian government itself has not fully resolved its internal debate about how much it is willing to concede.
Trump has given himself a 10-day window to decide. That window has not yet closed. U.S. naval forces remain positioned in the region. Iran's ballistic missile forces remain on alert. The IRGC naval forces are still in the Strait of Hormuz. The hardware of war is still present, even as the language of diplomacy becomes, cautiously, more audible. History tells us that crises like this can resolve in two very different ways. Sometimes, the combination of military pressure, economic pain, and back-channel diplomacy produces a deal. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended when both Kennedy and Khrushchev found a way to give each other just enough room to step back. Sometimes, miscalculation, one wrong move, one provocation that spirals, produces the war that neither side wanted, but both sides were positioned to fight. We will be watching this story around the clock and bringing you every update as it happens. If you want to be among the first to know when the next development breaks, hit subscribe below and turn on notifications. We are keeping this page updated continuously as events unfold. I'm your anchor. This is your channel. And this is the story that matters most, right now, in the world. Thank you for watching. Stay informed. Stay safe.